In fact, requiring that you have to have an explanation of the explanation obviously immediately leads to an infinite regress, because then you would need an explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and so on to infinity, so that nothing could ever be explained and science would be destroyed. So ironically, this principle that Dawkins seems to assume here or embrace would actually be destructive of science itself. So in the case at hand, in order to recognize that intelligent design is the best explanation of the appearance of design in the universe, you don't need to be able to explain the designer. Second point, however, Dawkins thinks that in the case of a divine designer of the universe, the designer is just as complex as the thing to be explained, so that no advance in explanation is made. Now, this objection raises all sorts of difficult questions about the role played by simplicity in assessing scientific explanations. Simplicity is just one of the criteria that scientists use in assessing competing hypotheses. Even more important than simplicity will be things like explanatory power, for example, explanatory scope. There will also be things like the degree of ad hocness, the degree to which this is contrived or artificial, its plausibility, and so forth. So that simplicity is just one of an array of criteria that must be balanced against each other in order to assess competing hypotheses. And some hypothesis may be less simple than another, but have much greater explanatory scope or explanatory power, and therefore be preferable despite its being less simple. You cannot simply dismiss a hypothesis on the grounds of simplicity without weighing it in conjunction with these other criteria. But let's leave those questions aside. I think the more fundamental mistake that Dawkins makes is his assumption that a divine designer is just as complex as the contingent universe. And I think that's clearly false. As an unembodied mind, God is a remarkably simple entity. As a non-physical entity, a mind is incredibly simple because it has no parts. A mind isn't composed of different parts to be a composition. And as for the salient properties of a mind, things like self-consciousness, rationality, and volition, well, those are essential to a mind. A mind could not lack those properties and still be a mind. So in contrast to the contingent and variegated universe with all its different properties and constants and quantities and inexplicable appearances of design, a divine mind is startlingly simple. Certainly, such a mind may have complex ideas. That's true. This mind might be contemplating the infinitesimal calculus, which is a very complex idea. But the mind itself is a very simple entity, being an immaterial entity not composed of parts. Dawkins has, I think, evidently confused a mind's ideas, which may be very complex, with a mind itself, which is really an incredibly simple entity. And therefore postulating a divine mind behind the variegated and contingent universe most certainly does represent a considerable advance in the simplicity of one's explanation for whatever that might be worth. Now, other steps in Dawkins' argument, I think, are also problematic, and I'll be addressing those further this afternoon. But I think that enough has been said at this point to show that this argument does nothing to undermine a design inference based upon the universe's complexity, and it certainly doesn't serve as any sort of justification for atheism. It does nothing to prove that God does not exist. And therefore, it does seem to me that at the very center of Dawkins' book, there is a void. The book really collapses into this void that is taken by this clearly fallacious and invalid argument.